Friends, let me tell you about Ann Donahue. Ann Donahue graduated from Georgetown University, and before getting on with life, she decided that she was going to spend a couple of years doing volunteer work as a way of kind of giving back and to give her time to make more definite plans for the future. So she signed up as a volunteer at Covenant House in New York City. And Covenant House, as you probably know, exists to care for and care about young people, many of them are runaway kids who wind up in New York City, and they wind up getting exploited by unscrupulous people. They wind up getting addicted to drugs, and they wind up getting into such unsavory things as prostitution. So every night at 10 o'clock, Ann and another volunteer would be putting gallons of hot chocolate and bags of sandwiches into the Covenant House van. And for the next couple of hours, the van, with a dove painted on the door, would tour the city's juvenile prostitution areas. The volunteers simply offer free sandwiches and hot chocolate to these runaway kids who are working the streets there. And Ann says about what you're hoping to accomplish, she says, we're out there because we know that a lot of the kids have not tried Covenant House as an alternative to living on the streets. About 2/3 have never even heard of it. And she goes on to say that what they're doing is showing these kids that someone cares, that someone is out there who's neither buying them nor selling them. And then she went on to say that shortly after she got there, in her first year as a volunteer, she says, and these are her words, "I became deeply depressed. What kind of God would let kids suffer so much? Finally, it got through to me. God is not going to come down and show them his love. We have to let God's love work through us." I like that story. I especially like her two final comments. First, she says, God's not going to come down and show us his love. She's absolutely right, because God has already done that in the person of Jesus Christ. God has come down. That's what Advent is all about. We're preparing to celebrate that very thing. God has come down. And secondly, she says, we have to let God's love work through us. Again, she's absolutely right. When Jesus, after 33 years on earth, ascended back to his Father, he left us in charge to continue doing what he had begun. In other words, just as the Father had worked through Jesus during his life on earth, so Jesus taught us to let the Father work through us. We are to be the channels of God's grace, God's help, just as Jesus was. And that's what Ann was doing as she was driving her van with the dove on the door through the seedy areas of New York City. She was serving as a channel of God's goodness to a lot of needy young people. She's really doing what Mary did when we celebrate the Annunciation, the first of the joyful mysteries. Mary says yes to God's invitation to be a vehicle of his love in today's world. What Ann is doing, what Mary did, we also must do. If Jesus is to be born, so to speak, into our world today, has to be through us. We sometimes forget that at some point in our lives here on earth, God invites us to say what Mary said, I am the servant of the Lord, let it be done to me according to your will. Christmas, is traditionally, it's a children's feast. It's a time when we introduce children to the great mystery that Jesus brought God down to earth. But we strive always, I think, Catholic parents, to make sure the kids understand the real meaning of Christmas. You know, that it's not about Santa Claus and toys and reindeer and all of that. I mean, that's fun, but I mean, you get beyond that. It has to do with the birth of Jesus. It has to do with God coming to earth. But sometimes we stop short of giving the full Christmas message. Yes, that's the message. It's the birth of Jesus. But we need to go a step further and teach them why Jesus brought God to us. It was to teach us that we too must bring God to others. I was reading about Ross Perot. Maybe that's a name you probably remember from, I don't know when it was he ran for president, but he was not always, he is today, I believe, still a multi-billionaire in Texas, but he wasn't always that. He relates that during Depression times, when he was growing up, his family was poor, and they had to struggle to make a living. They lived in Texarkana. I think that's Texas, right? I don't know. It's down there somewhere. It's either Texas or Arkansas, as far as I can see, but Texarkana. And anyway, Texarkana was a railroad stop, junction, and because of that, in those days, there were a lot of men who just rode the railroads. You know, there were bums, there were hobos, and he noticed that they would often stop at his home. And Ross's mother never turned anybody away, but she wondered why so many hobos were coming to the door looking for a meal. And then one day she learned the reason. One of the hobos told her that the curb in the front of the house had a marking on it, a code that no one but another hobo would understand. It was a message saying, you can get a free meal here. So that's why all of these hobos were coming. And Ross says, I asked my mom, should I get rid of that mark on the curb? No, she said, leave it there. And here's what he said about that. We are all what we are taught to be. You sit in that little house in Texarkana and you see your parents doing things like that when you're a child. That's the greatest lesson in the world. And Ross is right, it is the greatest lesson in the world. The reason it's the greatest lesson is because it's the lesson Jesus taught us through his coming on earth. It's a lesson that we must bring God to others just as Jesus did. We must be, as St. Francis used to say, instruments of his peace, channels of his grace. It's a lesson that we learn and relearn each Advent and hopefully pass on to our children. That's what Ann Donahue was doing each night in New York City. That's what Ross Perot's mother was doing in Texarkana. That's what Jesus did in his world, and that's what we need to do in our world. Unless we learn this lesson, and I would say relearn it, because we learn it, but we have a way of forgetting things, relearn it, and also pass it on to our children, then we've missed the whole point of the feast we are planning to celebrate this week. Amen. And now I invite our candidate for full member